Coppervale, Texas, October 14th, 1886. Caleb Holt came into that barn the way he came into most trouble slow, lantern high, rifle ready. The dark shifted. Then a girl stepped out of it. She wasn't trembling. Both feet planted, chin up, a rusted knife in her right hand, held like she'd already decided to use it, and in her eyes, not fear. Something harder than fear. Under Texas Civil Statute, Section 843, she said, voice dead level in the midnight quiet. Detaining a minor against their expressed wishes without lawful authority constitutes false imprisonment. I want you to know I know that. 11 years on this land. Caleb had been threatened, cheated, lied to, and once shot at. Nobody had ever cited statute at him in his own barn at midnight. Then from behind the bales one sound. One word. Broken clean in half. And Nora. He looked at the rifle in his hands. Then he set it down in the hay, where she could see it, and sat down on the dirt floor of his own barn. This is the story of what happens when the loneliest man in Coppervale finally sits down low enough to see 3 children who had nowhere left to go. He heard it because the window was open. 11 years. Caleb Holt had slept with that window shut every night since Maggie. Tonight he'd left it open without knowing why, just stood there before bed. Looked out at the ridge gone dark and didn't close it. Later he'd wonder about that. The sound from the barn was small. A shuffle. Something trying not to be heard. Coyotes don't try. Whatever this was, it was trying. He pulled on his boots, took the rifle off the wall, and grabbed the lantern off the hook. On the porch, he passed the whiskey glass he'd left there, 1 glass. Same night, every year. Same ritual since 1875. He left it sitting, walked out into the October dark with his head clear. That was a choice. He wouldn't understand for a while how much it mattered. The barn door swung open. Lantern light swept across the hay. The stalls, the horses shifting in the dark. He moved slow, no rush. Let whoever it was hear him coming. Show yourself, he said. Nothing. He lifted the lantern higher, moved past the first row of bales. Then a girl stepped out of the shadow. She wasn't trembling. That was the first thing he noticed. She'd put herself square between him and whatever was behind her. Feet planted, chin up. In her right hand was a short knife gone half to rust. She held it like she'd use it. But she didn't threaten him, she said, under Texas Civil Statute, Section 843. Detaining a minor against their expressed wishes without lawful authority constitutes false imprisonment. I want you to know I know that. Caleb Holt had been threatened, cheated, lied to, and once shot at by a man with bad aim. Nobody had ever cited statute at him in his own barn at midnight. He didn't move. I hear you, he said. Then from behind the bale one sound. One word, and Nora, 2 syllables broken clean in the middle. Not from any flaw in the mouth. From something else. Something the body does when it's learned that talking too much costs you. Caleb had heard horses sound like that. Animals in pain keeping quiet about it. He lowered the rifle without deciding to. Then he did something that Nora would think about for a long time after. He didn't step forward, didn't reach out a hand, didn't say I won't hurt you words that had been said before and broken before. He sat down not on a bale, not on a rail, on the dirt floor of his own barn, at the level of a child's eyes. He set the rifle in the hay beside him, where she could see it, and he couldn't reach it fast. No man of standing in Coppervale, Texas, in the year 1886, sits on a barn floor for a stranger's benefit. Nora's knife lowered 1 inch. I'm not getting up, he said, until you tell me what you need tonight. Just tonight. Tomorrow is tomorrow's problem. She studied him. He let her. He'd learned a long time ago that the worst thing you can do to a person trying to figure out if you're safe is rush them. Finally, she said, Sam doesn't get called the boy or the kid. His name is Sam. Pearl is Pearl. I'm Nora. We have names. Caleb Holt. This here is Redstone Ranch. He looked around at the hay, the scattered evidence of more than one night. My barn, that you've been sleeping in, looks like more than a night. Three nights. He nodded. I've had worse house guests. Something at the corner of her mouth shifted. Not a smile. Not a smile either. Then from the dark hollow between the bales, 2 small figures came forward. The girl Pearl had her thumb halfway to her mouth and her eyes all the way open, taking in the lantern, the man on the floor, the barn all at once, deciding about all of it simultaneously. The boy, Sam, stepped in front of her without thinking about it. Caleb looked at the two of them. Then he looked at his hands. Lord Almighty, he thought. He didn't say it out loud. The walk to the house was short. Sam pressed his face into Caleb's shoulder. The second Caleb picked him up, and the boy weighed nothing. Less than the feed sacks, Caleb moved without noticing. He shifted Sam against his chest and didn't look at his own face because he could feel what it was doing, and he wasn't ready to examine it. Pearl walked herself, holding Nora's hand, looking up at the dark house. Does it have a fire inside? Has one going. Then it's good enough. She walked in. Nora came last. Still had the knife. He didn't mention it. He ladled stew into 4 bowls. First time in 11 years, he'd set 4 places at that table. He stood looking at the 4th bowl a second too long, then turned back to the stove. Pearl ate like she had somewhere to be. Sam ate fast and quiet, the way you eat when you're not sure it stays. Nora sat at the corner of the table, where she could see the door and the window both. She ate 3 bites and stopped. Nora, Caleb didn't turn around. If you don't eat, those two are going to stop eating to worry about you. Neither one of them's had enough tonight to afford that. So eat a long beat, then the sound of a spoon. Later, after Pearl was asleep and Sam was nearly there, Caleb crouched down to the boy's level and said not at him, just into the air between them. In this house, nobody gets rushed when they're talking. That's not a rule I made up to be kind. That's just how people ought to treat each other. Sam looked at him, said nothing. Then, slow and deliberate as a man signing a deed, he raised his thumb. Caleb nodded. Good. He sat at the kitchen table after they'd gone up, took out a piece of paper, wrote 3 names, Sam, Pearl. He looked at them for a while. Then he wrote underneath, what do they need? Not what should he do with them. Not what would happen next. Just that. He didn't have answers yet. But a man who asks the right question first is better placed than a man who starts with answers. He went to bed. Walked past the whiskey glass still sitting on the porch railing. Left it there. Upstairs, through the floorboards, he could hear 3 children breathing. It was the first October 14th in 11 years that he hadn't spent alone. He didn't realize that until he was already asleep. Caleb was up before the children. That wasn't unusual. He was always up before dawn. What was unusual was why. It wasn't the cow. It wasn't the fence line in the south pasture that needed checking. It was something simpler and harder to name. 3 children were sleeping in rooms that hadn't held anyone sleeping in 11 years, and some part of him had decided, without asking his permission, that when they woke up in a strange house, there ought to be a familiar face already downstairs. He didn't examine this. He just made coffee and started breakfast. He was cracking eggs when the knock came. Brief, businesslike. He set the pan down and opened the door. Deputy Lena Marsh. He knew her by sight. She'd been stationed out of Coppervale 2 years now. Long enough that he'd seen her at the Mercantile and once settling a property dispute in front of the hardware store. She was in civilian clothes this morning, not uniform. She was holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. Dr. Pruitt keeps a supply of fever medicine locked at his office, she said. I have a key for emergencies. Word reached me there might be sick children at Redstone. Caleb held the door and looked at her. Word travels fast. I was at the Rivera's place when Tomas came by at 4 in the morning. I was already awake. She held out the package. I'm not here in any official capacity. I'm here because Tomas Rivera doesn't ride out at 4 in the morning for nothing. He took the package. You want to come in? Not yet. She met his eyes straight on. When you're ready to tell me what's happening here, I'll be ready to listen. Until then, she nodded at the medicine, the girl with the cough. That'll help. She turned and rode back down the road before he could think of another question. He stood in the doorway, watching her go. From this distance, he noticed something small in her left breast pocket, something catching the early light. Metal. Could have been a watch. Could have been something else. He closed the door and went back to the eggs. He set 4 bowls on the table. He hadn't done that in 11 years. He stood looking at the 4th one a moment longer than the others. Then Pearl appeared, at the bottom of the stairs, hair everywhere, eyes half open, barefoot on the wood floor, and looked at the bowl and looked at him and pulled it toward her side of the table. That one's mine, she said, and sat down. I was saving that for someone. Well, I'm here and they're not. He could not find the flaw in this argument. He didn't try. Nora came down next, quiet and watchful. Taking in the kitchen, the way someone takes in a room they're not sure they're allowed to be comfortable in. Sam came last, standing at the foot of the stairs with his hand on the railing, looking at the table, looking at Caleb, looking at the table again. Sit wherever, Caleb said. He turned back to the stove. Food's hot, that was all. No ceremony, no speech about welcome. Just food's hot, same as he'd say to any hand who came in from the morning. Sam sat down after breakfast. Caleb went to the cedar chest on the upstairs landing. He hadn't fully thought it through. He just opened it and brought down the small wooden horse Maggie had carved the winter she was carrying. She'd made a whole set, working by the fire in the evenings, humming to herself. He set it on the table in front of Pearl, thinking she might like something to play with. Pearl picked it up, turned it over, looked at it the way she looked at everything, slow and thorough, like she was reading it. Whose is this? Used to belong to my wife. Is she here? She passed. Pearl thought about this. Then she got up, walked to the windowsill that faced west toward the ridge, and set the horse there facing out. That way she can see the hills, Pearl said. Matter of fact, people who are gone still like to look at the things they liked. She came back and picked up her spoon. Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. That's a kind thought, he finally managed. Pearl shrugged. It's just true. Tomas Rivera arrived at first light the way he always did on his bay mare Cora. He found Sam standing at the fence line outside the barn, not going in, just standing there, watching the horses through the slats. Tomas didn't ask what the boy was doing, didn't introduce himself. He pulled up beside Sam and leaned on the fence and watched the horses too. 2 minutes, maybe 3. Then Tomas opened the gate and walked into the barn without looking back. Sam followed. The big roan in the third stall, the one Caleb didn't let anyone ride, stood still when Sam laid a hand on his neck. Tomas watched from the doorway and said nothing. Later he'd tell Caleb, that horse lets exactly 2 people touch him, you and the boy. Caleb said nothing back, but he filed it away in the place where he kept things that mattered. Nora found the farm ledgers on the shelf near the window. She pulled one out, saw the blank pages in the back, and asked without preamble, can I use these? What for? Evidence. She opened to a blank page and started writing. Dates, names, events in order. Caleb looked over her shoulder. Inside 2 minutes, he could see she was building a legal record more carefully organized than most deposition documents he'd ever seen come out of a courthouse. He sat down across from her. Where'd you learn to do this? Newspapers. Books left at the schoolhouse. A law manual that belonged to a lawyer Wade hired once. She didn't look up. I read it while he was asleep. How long did that take? 2 nights. He sleeps hard when he's been drinking. Caleb sat with that. It was too heavy to lift all at once. Then you read a law manual in 2 nights. I read it to know what he was allowed to do. She looked up then. Her eyes weren't angry. They were clear, the way creek water is clear when there's nothing clouding it. There's a difference between knowing your rights and knowing the exact edge of someone else's. If you know where the law stops, you know where to stand. Caleb had read contracts and deeds and water rights agreements for 20 years. He had never heard anyone 14 years old talk like this. You should be in school, he said, before he'd thought about it. I know. She went back to writing. That's what I'm working toward. That evening, Sam sat near the fire while Pearl slept on the rug. Caleb pulled a chair up across from the boy, not too close, and looked at the fire instead of at Sam. I talked too fast earlier, he said. I noticed you had to work to keep up. That was my fault, not yours. I'll slow it down, Sam looked at him. And I don't need you to answer me if you don't have one ready. Silence is fine in this house. He looked at Sam then. It's not an insult. It's just silence. Sam picked up a piece of kindling from the basket and turned it over in his hands. Not fidgeting, thinking. Then he set it down and raised his thumb, slow and deliberate. Caleb nodded. Good. He went to bed later than usual. Through the floorboards, he could hear 3 children breathing. The cedar chest was still open on the landing. He'd forgotten to close it after getting the horse. He could see the edge of the white cotton Maggie had wrapped everything in. He closed the chest, stood with his hand on the lid. Then he went to bed and did not lie awake, Doctor. Elias Pruitt arrived on the 2nd morning. He came because Caleb had sent Tomas before sunup with a simple message. Children at Redstone. Medical lookover needed. Personal favor if he came early. Don't explain beyond that. Pruitt came within the hour. He was 67 years old and had the face of a man who had chosen, somewhere along the way, to keep being surprised by things. He set his bag on the kitchen table and looked at the three children and said, "Who's first?" Pearl raised her hand. He listened to her chest, made notes. The cough was early stage. Caught in the cold nights. Treatable. He wrote it down and told her what the medicine was and why it would help. Pearl asked 3 follow-up questions. He answered all 3. Then Sam. Pruitt examined him carefully and found 2 healed rib bruises, yellowed at the edges. 3 weeks old, maybe 4. He recorded the location. The size, the color, the specificity of a man who understood that a medical record can outlast a lie. He didn't react. He didn't let his face do anything that would make Sam want to close off. He simply said, "I'm going to write this down exactly as it is. You don't have to say anything about it. The writing is enough." Then he paused. He looked at Sam directly. "Is it all right with you that I write it down?" "I won't if you'd rather I didn't." Sam stared at him. No adult had ever asked his permission before doing something to his body. The concept took a moment. Then he nodded. Pruitt wrote it down. Nora stood across the table with her arms crossed, watching. He set his pen down and looked at her. "I need to document what I see," he said. "I won't write anything without telling you first. I won't tell you anything I'm not willing to put in the record. Your body is yours. My job is to write down what I observe so that piece of paper can go places you might not be able to go yourself." A long pause. Nora uncrossed her arms and sat down. After, when Sam had gone out to the barn with Tomas and Pearl was occupied with the kindling basket, Nora sat with Pruitt at the kitchen table. She talked for 40 minutes. She spoke the way someone speaks when they've rehearsed it mentally 100 times. Dates first, then events, then consequences. No embellishment, no feeling in the voice. She'd learned somewhere that emotion in testimony is a weapon the other side will use against you. Pruitt wrote without interrupting. When she got to the night, Cutter brought Doyle to the house. The night, a man in a good suit walked through their rooms speaking pleasantly about crop prices, while his eyes moved over Sam the way a buyer's eyes move over a steer. At auction, Pruitt stopped writing. Did he give his name? He introduced himself. Hector Doyle said he was out of Dallas. Pruitt set the pen down flat. He looked out the window at the ridge, gone pale gray in the morning light. Something moved across his face that Nora caught immediately. She was very good at reading faces. "You've heard that name," she said. "Yes." He picked the pen back up. "Tell me the rest." She told him the rest. After she'd gone outside, Pruitt stood with Caleb in the kitchen and kept his voice low. 3 years ago, a family out of Reeves County lost a boy, 9 years old. Found him 6 months later working the docks in Galveston. 2 witnesses described the man who brokered it. Well-dressed, well-spoken, named Doyle. Caleb's jaw tightened. Was he arrested? He was not. He had an arrangement inside the deputy marshal's office in that district. The case was closed for insufficient evidence, which in practice meant the witnesses were persuaded to become less certain. Pruitt picked up his bag. "I'm telling you this so you understand what you're dealing with. This is not a bad stepfather with a drinking problem. That would be bad enough. This is a system, a man with infrastructure and people inside other systems keeping it running. What do you suggest? Don't go to the county sheriff until you know more than you know now. Let me make some quiet inquiries." And he paused at the door. "Don't let those children feel like they're in danger while you're figuring this out. They've been in danger long enough. Let them have some days that don't feel like it." Before he left, Pruitt gathered all 3 children in the kitchen. He didn't stand over them. He sat at their level and spoke to them the way you speak to people whose time and attention matter. "I want you to understand something about today. I asked your permission before I examined you. I told you what I was writing and why. That's not unusual for me. That's how medicine ought to be practiced. Your body is yours. No one has the right to make decisions about it without your knowledge and your agreement. That doesn't stop being true because you're children. It doesn't stop being true because someone older than you says otherwise. It's true because you are people, and people own themselves." Pearl had been thinking hard, even when we're 5. Especially then. Small people are the easiest to forget this about, which is exactly why it matters most to say it to small people. Pearl considered this with the serious attention she gave to all important things. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied that the doctor had gotten it right. After Pruitt had gone, Nora folded a piece of paper and brought it to Caleb without comment. He opened it. 7 names, ages next to each one, towns, dates. Where did you get these? We stopped 8 times in 9 days. People talk at water pumps and feed stores. I listened. She sat down across from him. I don't know if they're all connected to Doyle, but I don't think we're the only ones. Caleb looked at the list, at the names, at the ages. The youngest was 4 years old. Nora. Yes. You collected this while you were running, with 2 children, one of them sick. In October, I had to do something. Not defensive, just factual. Standing still wasn't surviving. So I kept moving and kept my eyes open. That's all I know how to do. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. I'm going to write a letter tonight to my sister. Her name is Jo. She's a school teacher in San Antonio. She knows people I don't know and thinks in ways I don't think. Is she trustworthy? She's family. That's not what I asked. Caleb looked at her. Yes, she's trustworthy, Nora nodded slowly. She was not fully convinced, but she was willing to wait and see, which was the closest she currently came to trust. And she knew it, and he understood. He went to write the letter. When he came back to the porch later, the night was clear in the way West Texas nights get clear, like someone had taken the sky and wrung it out until every particle of cloud was gone, and what was left was just stars all the way to the ground. He sat with the sealed letter in his hand. Then he heard it, hoofbeats on the road, coming up slow, stopping at the far end of the access lane. Staying there, he went still, listened. The sound didn't advance. After a long time, it moved on. He sat on the porch after it was quiet. Then he went inside, set the rifle next to the front door, and went upstairs. He didn't mention it in the morning. Day 5 at Redstone Ranch. No crisis. No arrival, just the ordinary pull of a cattle operation in October, feed to move. Fence to check, a sick calf in the east pen that needed watching. The kind of day that in any other week would pass without anyone noticing it. This week, it was the most important kind of day there was. A day where 3 children got to simply exist without having to justify existing. Esperanza Rivera arrived mid-morning with a pot she'd need 2 hands to carry. Tomas had not told her much. He'd told her enough. Esperanza had lived long enough to know that some things you respond to before you fully understand them. She set the pot on the stove and started heating it without asking. 4 adults and 3 children around the kitchen table. Pearl ate 2 tamales before anyone mentioned they were spiced. She didn't find them spicy. She announced her verdict with the authority of someone who had weighed the evidence and reached a conclusion. These are the best things I've ever had. I want them every day. Esperanza looked at her for a moment, then said something to Tomas in Spanish. Tomas smiled. Caleb didn't catch it all, but he caught the word for keep. Tomas told his story during the meal. He spoke in English mixed with Spanish, not apologizing for it, because it was his language and his story, and he didn't owe anyone a cleaner version of either. He was 9 years old, he said, when a man came to purchase him for a cotton operation west of Houston. He told it plain. No drama around it. Just the facts arranged in order, the way a carpenter lays boards before he decides which ones to use. The woman who stopped it was a Quaker widow. She stepped between Tomas and the buyer and said 3 things. She said, "This child is a person." She said, "People are not sold." She said, "I won't move." That's all she said. Tomas told them. 3 sentences. Her husband's store lost customers over it. People stopped doing business with them. She didn't change her position once. Sam was listening the way he always listened, which was total and invisible. He asked. Through the careful signs, Tomas had already begun teaching him what happened to her afterward. She got old, Tomas said. She stayed in the same town her whole life, kept her store, kept her principles. Every year on the anniversary of that day, she baked a cake for whoever she'd helped most that year. He looked at Sam. That's what it looks like when a person decides they'd rather be inconvenient than dishonest. Sam looked at his hands, then back at Tomas. Then he signed, "Thank you," one of the 12 words he'd learned so far. Tomas nodded. "You're welcome." After the meal, Tomas spread 12 signs across the table like a card game. Not the whole language. A working vocabulary. Yes, no, hungry, safe. Stop, good. Come, stay. Name, thank you. Wait. Caleb sat down on the floor next to Sam and learned alongside him. This surprised the boy. You could see the small adjustment in how he was holding his shoulders, the way his eyes moved to check if Caleb was serious. He was serious. Pearl joined without being invited and learned faster than anyone, which surprised no one who'd spent 20 minutes with her. Within the hour, the four of them were managing full exchanges. Nora sat at the far edge of the room with her chair pointed away, then gradually turned it, then gradually moved closer, then was signing along without having announced she was participating. The lesson inside the lesson didn't need to be said out loud. It was right there in the doing of it. Language isn't only words. Respecting someone means finding the way they can reach you, not standing still and waiting for them to reach you in the way you prefer. Reverend Amos Clay arrived in the late afternoon. Caleb saw him coming up the road and felt the old familiar tightening. Not because of Clay, because of Coppervale in 1886, and the way a county's eyes worked, and the math a black man had to do every time he rode onto a white man's property without a declared and legible reason. Clay rode up to the gate and met Caleb's gaze head-on. "I heard there are children here who need to know that not every grown person in the world can be trusted," he said, "but also that some can. I came to be an example of the second thing." Caleb opened the gate wider. "We've got tamales left, then I'm exactly on time." After supper, the children went inside, and Tomas and Esperanza headed home. Clay and Caleb sat on the porch steps in the cooling afternoon. The ridge had gone from rust to deep amber in the last light. "You know what those children and I have in common," Clay said, not rhetorical, a real question. "Tell me." "We've both spent time living in a country where the law existed, but didn't apply to us the same way it applied to other people. When that's your life, you stop trusting the law. Then you stop trusting the systems built on top of it. Then you stop trusting the people who represent those systems." And then he looked at the ridge. "You meet someone who doesn't behave the way you've been taught to expect. And that hurts different from the original injury, because it forces you to revise everything you thought you knew." "I'm not asking for their trust," Caleb said. "I know you're not. That's actually why I came." Clay looked at him. "Don't ask for it. Don't expect it on any particular schedule. And don't be hurt if it doesn't arrive the way you're hoping. Trust from a person who's been broken by trust is the most valuable thing there is. It cannot be rushed. What you can do is be exactly who you say you are, every single day, until being otherwise becomes simply unimaginable to them. That's a long project, it is. Most things worth doing are." Pearl had been at the screen door. She came out and sat between the two men as though she'd been invited, which she hadn't, and which didn't appear to concern her. "Reverend Clay," she said, "why don't some people like you?" Clay had had this conversation before, in different forms, with different children. He had never figured out a way to make the answer easier, so he gave her the true one. "Because of the color of my skin." Pearl frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "No, it doesn't. Then why?" "Because some people decided a long time ago that it did make sense, and they built laws and towns and ways of living on top of that decision. When you build a lot of things on top of a wrong idea, the idea gets very hard to change, because changing it means admitting that everything built on top of it needs to change too." Pearl was quiet, working through it. "So the wrong idea is like a bad foundation." "Exactly like that. You can't fix the house. You have to fix the foundation first." Clay looked at her for a moment. "Pearl Barrett," he said, "I have been trying to explain that to grown men for 30 years. Pearl nodded. She didn't seem surprised that she'd arrived at it in about 45 seconds. She got up, patted Clay's arm, once the way a grandmother pats someone, and went back inside. The two men sat in the quiet. "She's something," Clay said. "She is," Caleb said. They sat a while longer, watching the ridge go dark. When Clay finally rode off, Caleb stayed on the porch. He was watching the road when a rider came along the far end of it unhurried. Moving slow, the rider didn't turn in. But he slowed, and in the last gray light, Caleb could see the cut of a good coat and the specific, deliberate way the man's head turned toward Redstone Ranch before he rode on. Caleb stood on the porch until the road was dark and the sound of hooves was gone. Then he went inside and checked every window latch upstairs before he went to bed. He didn't say anything to the children about it. They had enough to carry already. He could carry this one himself. He lay in the dark and thought about what Clay had said, about what it meant to be the kind of person someone eventually decides to trust. about how long that took and how little of it you could speed up. He thought, I've got time. Then he thought, I hope I've got time. Then he went to sleep. Deputy Lena Marsh arrived on a Tuesday morning in full uniform, riding her own horse. Caleb had been expecting a visit since roughly 48 hours after the children arrived. In a county this small, nothing stayed unknown for long. What he hadn't expected was that she'd come alone. No summons, no hand near her sidearm. She tied her horse at the post and walked to the gate without hurrying. Those details told him what kind of visit this was. He met her at the fence. I have a missing persons report out of Jasper County, she said. 3 minors. Family name Barrett. Guardian of record is a man named Wade Cutter. The description matches children seen traveling west about 2 weeks ago. What are you planning to do with what you find here? She paused in Caleb's experience. People who pause before answering that question are the ones who are actually thinking about it rather than reciting something prepared. I'm here to listen, she said. What comes after depends on what I hear. That's as honest as you can be right now. Yes, all right. He opened the gate. Something happened in that exchange. Not warmth exactly. Not anything with a name yet. Something closer to the feeling of finding solid ground after walking on something uncertain for a long time. Both of them felt it. Neither one mentioned it. She sat on the lowest chair in the kitchen, which she chose without being told, putting herself at Pearl's eye level. Pearl looked her over. The badge, the boots, the way she was holding her hands open on her knees. Not crossed. You're a deputy, Pearl said. Yes. Are you going to take us back? A beat, 1 second too long. Pearl caught it immediately. She caught everything. Lena recalibrated. I'm here to understand what happened. Before I decide anything, I need to understand what happened. Pearl nodded slowly. Wade said children are a burden unless they make money. Lena wrote it down without reacting. Did he say that often? Not in front of Mama. But Mama heard him once. Pearl paused. I saw her cry. She didn't know I was watching. Lena and Sam sat on the porch alone. Before she started, she told him, my older brother is deaf. I know some signs, not everything, but enough to go back and forth if that's easier. Sam stared at her. A stranger knowing sign language was the second unexpected gift someone had given him in 1 week. He was beginning, cautiously, to revise what he'd understood about how the world worked. They used a mixture of signing and written notes. When she asked about the bruising on his ribs, Sam pulled up his shirt and pointed. He didn't wait to be asked twice. He just showed her. Lena recorded everything. Location, size, coloration. Approximate age of the injury. When she was done, she set down her pen and looked at him directly. Thank you for showing me that. I know that wasn't easy. Sam held her gaze, the longest he'd held anyone's gaze in months. Then he nodded. Nora had set the ledger on the table before Lena even came in. When Lena sat down, Nora opened it to the first page and turned it to face her without a word. Lena read carefully 1 page, 2 pages. 3, she turned them the way a professional reads a deposition line by line, date by date, nothing skipped. Halfway through, she stopped. You recorded dates.
Yes.
You recorded witnesses, where there were any. How long did this take you? I started the night I decided we were leaving. Nora met her eyes. I also knew that a written record from a 14-year-old wouldn't carry the same weight as adult testimony, so I wrote it in a way that could be corroborated. Lena read to the last page. She looked up. Nora, you've written Hector Doyle's name here. Yes, you're certain about that name. He introduced himself. I wrote it down within 10 minutes of him leaving the house. Lena closed the ledger carefully, put both hands flat on top of it. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, just 1 moment, and Caleb, watching from the doorway, saw in that pause the thing she'd told herself she would not let show. The recognition that this was bigger than she'd hoped it was going to be. You've made this more complicated, she told Nora, in a necessary way, but a harder way. Things that were easy for them to do, Nora said, should not be easy for them to keep doing. Lena and Caleb stood alone in the kitchen after the children had gone out. Doyle has protection, she said. Not at the county level. Higher, state level. If those children testify before we have independent corroborating evidence, we're handing the defense exactly what they need. How much time do we need? I don't know. I don't have a federal task force. I have my records and Pruitt's records, and the most organized evidence ledger I have ever seen produced by a minor. She almost smiled. It was a small thing, but it was there. How old is she? 14. Moment between them, not romantic yet. Something quieter than that. The sensation of being on the same side of a line that most people never bother to locate. Then Lena reached into her breast pocket for her notebook. And for a second, the ring caught the light. Silver. Plain, not on a finger. In a pocket. Caleb saw it. He let his gaze move on without asking. She would think about that on the ride home. That he'd seen and hadn't asked. That it had felt like being noticed without being examined. Those were different things. She knew that. She hadn't expected to feel the difference so clearly. Before she left, she gathered all three children in the kitchen. She didn't stand over them. She sat. I want to say something that's technically outside my job description. What happened to you was wrong. Not by someone's personal opinion, not by someone's religious code. Wrong by law. The basic legal principle of this country, as written after the Civil War, is that no person can be owned or traded by another person. That principle applies to children. It applied to all three of you. The system failed to protect you. She paused. That failure belongs to the system. Not to you, Pearl, but the system might still send us back. It might try, and if it does, I'll be standing in the way. Is that your job? It's my job to enforce the law. It's my decision to enforce the spirit of it. Not just the letter. Those are two different things. And the second one is a choice. Pearl thought about this. Then she nodded, which was how she indicated that someone had answered a question adequately. Lena rode back through Coppervale in the early evening. She passed the hotel, the only one in town, and noticed a man she didn't know standing at the second-floor window. He wasn't watching the street. He was watching the road south toward Redstone Ranch. Good suit, unhurried posture. The look of a man who doesn't need to be anywhere quickly because things are already arranged. She rode past without slowing. When she got home, there was an envelope on her desk. No postage, no return address. Inside was a single handwritten line. Be careful with the Holt situation. She locked it in her desk drawer. Sat for a long time looking at the wall. Then she opened the drawer again. Took out the envelope and made a copy of the line in her own hand, on a separate piece of paper, and put that piece of paper somewhere else. If there was only one copy of something, that something could disappear. She'd learned that a long time ago. Caleb's dog didn't bark for coyotes, didn't bark for deer or wagons. He barked for one thing, only a man on horseback moving with intent. He started at sunrise on a Wednesday. He didn't stop. Caleb was at the window before the coffee was hot. 2 wagons, 4 riders. He could see Wade Cutter at a quarter mile because of the way the man carried his shoulders. A war does something to a person's posture that 20 years doesn't undo. Hector Doyle sat in the lead wagon. Next to him was a man wearing a badge from a neighboring county. A badge that had no jurisdiction here. Caleb did not reach for the rifle. He went upstairs and knocked on Nora's door. Stay inside. Lock it. If you hear me say your name specifically, you can come out. Not before. He knocked on Sam's door next. Sam was already awake, already at the window. He'd been watching since the dog started. He signed to Caleb. One rider left the group. He pointed south, toward the barn. Caleb looked. The rider had split off and was moving easy and casual toward the barn's rear entrance, where the tool shed connected, where kept the spare ammunition and 2 working rifles. Caleb couldn't go after him without leaving the front approach unwatched. Sam signed again, faster. Tomas, he pointed at the barn side, then at himself. Then hayloft window. He can't see me from below. Caleb looked at him for a moment. Looked at the boy who the world had decided couldn't communicate reliably. This boy who had mapped the property in 5 days and was now laying out a plan in 4 signs. You go to the hayloft, Caleb said quietly. You sign to Tomas. He handles the man at the barn. You do not come down. You do not show yourself. Clear. Sam nodded. 2 minutes later, Tomas appeared at the corner of the barn as if he'd just been passing by, hands in his pockets, moving at ranch work pace. The rider on the south side wheeled his horse, startled. By the time the confrontation was happening at the front gate, Tomas was leaning on the barn door, having a conversation in Spanish with a man who couldn't find a way to leave without it looking deliberate. Nobody at the gate knew any of this had happened. Nobody except Caleb, who watched Tomas materialize at the barn corner and understood exactly what it meant. He thought, Sam did that. The boy who the world had written off because of how he spoke had just protected this property in the only language that was fast enough. Caleb filed that away and walked down the porch steps. Doyle stayed mounted. That was deliberate too. Height was authority. Caleb noted it and walked down 2 more steps, which put him on the same level as the wagon seat. Mr. Holt, I'm here as a legal representative in a guardianship matter. Mr. Cutter holds lawful custody of 3 minors. I'm requesting their peaceful return, and I'm prepared to overlook any legal complications that may have arisen from your temporarily sheltering them. Their names, Caleb are Nora, Sam and Pearl Barrett. Not 3 minors. Nora, Sam and Pearl. Start with their names or don't start. Doyle smiled pleasantly. Mr. Holt, I'm going to say something once. In front of witnesses. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The yard was quiet enough that everyone heard it. A child is not property. Not under God's law. Not under any law worth the paper it's written on. Children are born with the right to safety, to care, and to a life that doesn't require them to be afraid of the people responsible for them. Those rights exist before any guardianship paper is signed. They exist whether or not a court has gotten around to acknowledging them yet. If Mr. Cutter and Mr. Doyle believe a piece of paper authorizes what was done in that house, I'm telling them plainly that paper is wrong. And I'll spend whatever time it takes proving it. Reverend Clay had come around the side of the property. He'd arrived for his own reasons that morning and had found reasons to stay. He stepped forward 1 pace and said nothing. Just stood. Tomas, at the barn corner, stood with his arms crossed and his eyes open. He had the same posture he'd had the day Caleb hired him 15 years ago. Unmovable, not aggressive, just present. Esperanza stood at the kitchen window with a cast-iron skillet she was theoretically about to cook with. Clay spoke then. His voice was the voice of a man who'd preached in driving rain and been heard in the back row. I'll add something if nobody objects. I've spent my life being looked at and seen as something other than a person. I know that look exactly. It calculates instead of sees. It asks what is this worth instead of who is this. I've seen that look on the face of the man in that wagon when he came through this county 2 weeks ago. He let that sit. I am standing here today because I will not watch 3 children be subjected to that look without standing between them and it. Nobody responded to that. There wasn't much you could say to it. Then Pearl appeared in the doorway. Not because Caleb told her to come out. Because she was 5 years old, and the noise was outside, and she wanted to see. She stood at the threshold looking at the wagons, at the riders, at the crowd of people who had gathered at the fence line without anyone organizing them to. She looked at Wade Cutter, sitting his horse, at the back of the group, not looking at anyone. She didn't shout. She wasn't performing. She said what was true, the way she always did, in the same voice she used for everything. I remember when Wade taught me the names of birds. He knew everyone. She looked at the man on the horse. I don't know what happened to the man who knew that, but that's not him sitting back there. And I'm not going home with whoever that is. She turned and went back inside. The yard was completely quiet. Cutter didn't look up, but his hand on the reins changed. The fingers went loose. He was holding the leather differently than he had a moment before. The people watching him couldn't quite name what had shifted, but something had. Doyle ran his calculation. Legal risk, public witness count, the quality of the opposition, the available moves. He was good at calculations. He'd built his whole operation on them. He tipped his hat. We'll settle this through proper channels, Mr. Holt. The pleasantness in his voice was exactly what it had always been, a surface. Maintained. The wagons turned. The riders went with them. Cutter rode last, and near the bend in the road, he turned his head back once. His face was hard to read. Then he rode on. When the dust settled, Tomas stood beside Caleb and watched the road go quiet. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then Tomas said low in Spanish, "Esta no es la última vez." Caleb didn't have enough Spanish to translate it exactly, but he understood the tone. He nodded. That night he sat with Sam at the kitchen table and taught him 5 new signs. Watch, ready, signal, safe, trust. Sam learned all 5 in 20 minutes. He didn't ask why those 5. Some things didn't need explaining. 3 days later, a boy from a farm 4 miles east of town didn't come home for supper. His name was Thomas. He was 8 years old, brown hair, gap in his front teeth. His mother waited until dark before she started asking around. By morning, no one had seen him. He had nothing whatsoever to do with Doyle. Almost certainly, but almost certainly and definitely were not the same word. And in the Redstone kitchen that morning, every person over the age of 8 understood that the gap between those 2 words was doing a lot of work. Joe Holt stepped off the train from San Antonio with a single carpet bag, a stack of newspapers under her arm, and the look of a woman who had already made up her mind about several things and was prepared to be proved wrong about most of them, provided the evidence was solid. She was 48 years old. She had the same jaw as Caleb and the same habit of going quiet when she was working something out she hadn't solved yet. She'd taught history and geography to factory workers' children for 20 years, which meant she had precisely zero patience for the argument that some people weren't worth educating. She shook Pearl's hand at the gate. Pearl introduced herself. "I'm Pearl. Mr. Boots is your brother. I like you because you didn't pretend to smile when you got off the train. Most people pretend." Joe looked at Caleb. "I want to keep her. She's not mine to give." "I know. I want her anyway. Inside." Joe sat down next to Sam at the kitchen table and put a piece of blank paper between them. Then she wrote the alphabet across the top, slowly, every letter clear, and set the pencil down in front of him. "Start where you want," she said. "We can go forward or backward, or from the middle. Doesn't matter to me." She pulled a newspaper from her stack and started reading it. She wasn't watching him. She wasn't waiting visibly. She was just there, reading, with all the time in the world. Sam looked at the alphabet. Looked at her. She didn't look up. He picked up the pencil. He pointed at the letter S. She folded the corner of her newspaper. Good place to start. She read the evidence ledger in 20 minutes. She didn't speak while she read. When she finished, she closed it and put her hands flat on top. "Do you know who Elizabeth Cady Stanton is?" "I've read one article of hers," Nora said. "From 1,878. In 1,848, she stood in front of a crowd in Seneca Falls and read a declaration of women's rights. Most people in that room thought it was absurd. She was called hysterical. She was called dangerous. That document is now considered one of the most important texts in the history of American democracy." Joe tapped the ledger. "I'm not making a dramatic comparison. I'm making a factual one. What you've done here a careful, documented, legally informed record built at 14 while running for your life is not something most trained attorneys do well. You need to know that." She held Nora's gaze. "Not because he'll tell you, though he will. Because it's true, and you deserve to know true things about yourself." Nora was quiet. "It may not be enough, it may not, but it's extraordinary. And those are two separate facts." In the evening, when the children were settled and Caleb was outside, Joe sat at the kitchen table and told them something that Caleb couldn't tell them himself. He couldn't tell Maggie stories. He'd tried once, 2 years after she died, talking to a hand who'd asked about her. The words had stopped somewhere between his chest and his mouth, and he'd walked away from the conversation before it was over and hadn't tried again. Joe could tell them. She told them about Maggie Walker before she was Maggie Holt. How she was the daughter of a mill owner who had plans for her that involved a better address and a larger bank account. And she'd married a rancher instead because she said she'd rather spend her life with someone honest than someone polished. How she once talked a horse out of a mud bog by singing to it for 40 minutes. How she left books on Caleb's workbench with notes in the margins when she thought he needed to read something, but wouldn't ask her to find it for him. "She sounds like she knew what mattered," Nora said. "Absolutely," Joe smiled at the table. "She also burned every meal she ever cooked from scratch. Every single one. And she never once acknowledged this as a character flaw. Pearl did, Caleb did, Mr. Boots tell her she was burning things. He ate everything she put in front of him and told her it was fine until the day she died." Joe looked at all three of them. That's one kind of love. The kind where the fire in the pot doesn't matter because the person matters more. Pearl thought about this. Then she said, "That's the best kind." "I think so too," Joe said. Caleb heard the floorboard at the top of the stairs at midnight. He went down. Nora was at the kitchen table in the dark. He sat across from her and didn't light the lamp. Some conversations were easier in the dark. "I did everything right," she said after a while. "I recorded everything. I knew the statutes. I ran the right direction. Got them here." She looked at her hands. "And it still might not be enough." Caleb opened his mouth and said, "You've done everything you could do." Nora looked at him. "That was the wrong answer," she said quietly. "That's what people say when they don't know what else to say." He stopped, sat with that. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry." Then he was quiet. A real quiet, not the kind that fills space. The kind that happens when someone is actually working something out. Then what's true is this. Doing the right thing doesn't guarantee the right outcome. That is the worst fact I know about the world. And nobody can make it better with a different sentence. But here's what I actually believe. Doing what's right in a bad situation matters anyway. Not because it guarantees anything. Because it's the only thing you can actually control. And you, he looked at her, have controlled it completely. That's yours. No ruling changes it. Nora was quiet for a while. That's harder than the first answer. I know it is. You don't need me to make it easier. You need me to say what's true. Yes, another silence. How do you live with it? Doing right and not knowing if it works. One morning at a time. Literally. Tomorrow, breakfast. Day after that, breakfast again. You do the next right thing until the days start adding up to something that feels like more than just getting through. She thought about it. Did that work for you? After Maggie, he looked at the table. It took longer than I'd like to admit. She nodded. That was enough. She didn't need it wrapped up. She just needed to know it was survivable. Lena came by in the late afternoon with a legal update. Then she found one more thing to check. Then the children started setting the table. And Pearl said, without looking up from the silverware, "You're having supper with us," in the exact tone she used for facts. 7 people. The table was loud in a way it hadn't been in 11 years. Sam signed something to Pearl in the middle of the meal that made her laugh hard enough to choke on her cornbread. Tomas told a story about a goat he'd once tracked 3 miles across open country that ended with the goat, and Tomas staring at each other from either end of a very small arroyo. At some point, Caleb looked up and found Joe watching him. Watching, specifically, the way he'd been passing Lena the bread without thinking about it for the past 10 minutes. He looked at what Joe was looking at. Then he looked back at Joe. She said nothing. She took a sip of coffee. After dinner, in the kitchen. "You need more help out here?" Joe asked. She tilted her head toward the front room, where Lena was helping Pearl with something she was drawing. "Don't," Caleb said. "I'm just noting, Joe. She's good people, I'm aware." Joe smiled at her coffee cup. "I know you are, which is why I'm not saying anything more." Lena left last. She got her coat from the hook, said good night to each child by name, and walked out to her horse. Caleb went with her to the gate. She turned at the gate. "I looked into that boy. It wasn't Doyle." A beat. "Probably," she said. "Probably," he said back. "I hate that word right now." "So do I." She rode. He watched until she was past the bend and the dark swallowed the sound of her horse. Then he stood at the gate another minute in the cold, looking at the empty road. Then he went in and locked every door and checked every window. Only after that did he go upstairs. Judge Harriet Dunmore arrived on the morning train. One travel bag, no assistant. The expression of a woman who had heard every argument for why justice should wait and had found all of them insufficient. The courtroom filled before 9. Coppervale hadn't seen a case like this one. The particulars had moved through the county, the way things move in small places, accurate in outline, imprecise in detail, urgent in both versions. In the small anteroom off the main room, Caleb sat with Nora Sam, and Nora was reading the evidence ledger for the 7th time. Pearl was drawing on the back of a court notice she'd found on the floor. Sam was tapping a quiet rhythm on his knee, the technique Joe had taught him. "Barely visible, barely audible," Caleb said. "Whatever happens today, I need you to hear this. You did the right thing. That's not conditional on the verdict. The right thing is the right thing before it gets decided and after it gets decided, regardless of what gets decided." Pearl looked up. "But we want to win." "We do, so we're hoping the right thing also works today." "Yes, we are," she nodded and went back to her drawing. Pruitt took the stand first. He delivered his medical findings the way he did everything: precise, unadorned, without editorializing. A doctor who editorializes loses credibility. A doctor who sticks to documented fact is very hard to argue with. He had known this for 40 years. Doyle's attorney tried. "Isn't it possible these injuries were accidental?" Pruitt looked at the man the way you look at a question you anticipated and prepared for and have no respect for. "In 40 years of practice, I have examined injuries from accidents and injuries from deliberate force. The injuries documented in these children are consistent with the second category. I am prepared to state that under oath and to defend it under any cross-examination this court wishes to conduct." But you cannot rule out, I have not ruled anything out. I have stated what the evidence shows. The evidence is what it is. Lena presented the investigative record next, organized, cross-referenced. She had spent 3 weeks quietly acquiring corroborating files from 2 other county investigations. And what she laid on the table included documentation of 4 other children, across 2 other counties, connected by paper trail to transactions brokered by a man named Hector Doyle. When she said the number 4, the room shifted, not dramatically, just a reordering of posture. The kind that happens when a room understands something it didn't understand 30 seconds ago. Doyle's attorney stood before Nora was called. Your Honor, the witness is 14 years old. Under Texas statute, a minor's unsworn testimony requires. Dunmore looked at him over her reading glasses. The look lasted long enough that the attorney stopped talking before she said a word. Mr. Fellows, this court has heard the corroborating medical record, the corroborating investigative record, and the corroborating testimony of 2 adult witnesses. If you would like to argue further that this young woman's first-hand account of events in her own life should be withheld from this court's consideration, I encourage you to make that argument carefully. I am going to be listening to it closely. Fellows sat down. Miss Barrett, Dunmore said, please come forward. Nora walked to the witness chair. She set the ledger on the rail. She began exactly as she had before: dates, events, sequences, the same controlled account she had built and rebuilt since the night she decided to leave. She got through all of it. Then she set the ledger down, and she said something that wasn't in it. I am 14 years old. My whole life I've been told I'm too young to have opinions, too young to understand the law, too young to decide what happens to me. But nobody told me I was too young to feel what was done to me. Nobody told me I was too young to live with the consequences of decisions adults made about my life without asking me. She paused. If I'm old enough to bear those consequences, then I'm old enough to be heard when I describe them. The room was very quiet. Sam doesn't speak the way this court is used to hearing testimony. That doesn't mean he has nothing to say. It means the world hasn't learned yet to listen the way he speaks. I'm asking this court to be better than that. Pearl is 5 years old. She sees the truth about people before most adults do, because she hasn't learned yet to politely pretend she doesn't. Please don't teach her to. She folded her hands on the ledger. That's what I have. At the front of the gallery, Sam lifted the ledger 1 inch off his knees, just 1 inch, the only signal he knew she'd understand. She saw it. She nodded once. Then she stepped down. Doyle's attorney was mid-argument when Wade Cutter stood up. He didn't ask permission. He stood from the respondent's table, and he looked at Nora, who was sitting in the gallery with Caleb on one side and Sam on the other. What he saw, and the room would feel this without understanding, it was a ghost. The posture of a young woman who refused to be broken, holding herself the same way her mother had held herself in the last months of her life, when the cancer was winning. And Clara had refused to let it change who she was. He had loved that woman. He still did, in the wreckage of who he'd become. And somewhere inside that wreckage, the man he'd been before the war still had access to a vote. I'm withdrawing my claim, Cutter said. His voice was flat, empty. The voice of someone setting something down they don't intend to pick back up. Doyle's attorney. Wait, I withdraw the guardianship claim. He looked at the floor. Clara would be ashamed of me. I'm aware of that. I don't have anything else to say, he said. The room was completely silent. Lena was already on her feet. The handcuffs were already in her hand. She had been ready for this since before she walked into the building. Doyle didn't resist. He was too sophisticated for that. Hector Doyle, Lena said, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit trafficking of minors, violation of the Federal Anti-Peonage Act of 1867. And additional charges to be enumerated at the county jail. Dunmore waited until Doyle had been walked out. Then she looked at the room. I want something added to the record. The failure to protect these children was not one person's failure. It was a system's failure. Officers who received reports and filed them without acting. Neighbors who noticed and calculated whether it was their business. A social architecture that treats what happens inside a household as private, until the damage is visible enough to ignore. That is the failure this court is also judging today. And it is a failure this community should not accept as normal. It is a lesson in what must change. She banged the gavel outside in the October sun. Pearl took Nora's hand. You shook the whole time, Pearl said. I know. You didn't sound like it. You could tell. I was right behind you. Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she did something she hadn't done since the day their mother remarried. She cried. Not loudly. Not with collapse. Just the quiet release of something held too long. The way a rope finally goes slack when you stop pulling against it. Pearl held her hand and didn't say anything. Because Pearl understood. In the way 5-year-olds understand things when they're paying attention. That some moments don't need words. They just need company. The weeks between the first hearing and the final custody decision were not dramatic. They were breakfasts and fence work, and the particular rhythm of a ranch moving into winter. Wood to split, cattle to move to the south pasture. A roof section on the chicken coop that needed patching before the cold came in hard. And inside that rhythm, 3 children were relearning something they'd almost forgotten how to do. They were learning to have a day that didn't require them to brace for it. Joe arranged for Sam to start at the Coppervale schoolhouse on the second Monday of November. His first day was not triumphant. A boy in the back row laughed when Sam spoke. Not cruel exactly, more reflexive. The way children laugh at unfamiliar things before they understand what they're doing. The teacher, Miss Aldrich, stopped the lesson. She had been teaching in Coppervale for 11 years and had seen approximately everything. She asked the boy to come to the front of the room. She asked him to repeat what he'd found funny. He couldn't. That's because there's nothing funny here, she said. What's happening is that Sam Barrett is trying to tell you something. When a person is trying to tell you something, your only job is to listen. The way they speak is not the point. What they're saying is the point. If you confuse those two things, you'll spend your whole life hearing the sound and missing everything that matters. She moved on with the lesson. At recess, the boy found Sam at the water pump and apologized. Awkwardly, the way children apologize when they've been corrected by someone they respect and have actually taken it in. Sam signed okay. The boy stared at his hands. What does that mean? Sam showed him. By the end of recess, they were at the water pump, going through the signs Sam knew, one by one, the boy trying each one and getting most of them wrong and trying again. Sam came home and told Caleb what happened, laboriously, one word at a time, the effort visible. Caleb listened to the whole thing without rushing a single word, without filling a single pause. When Sam finished, Caleb said, sounds like a decent kid, who needed correcting and took it. Sam said, yeah, one word, clean. No interruption. He didn't notice it at first. Then he did. Caleb noticed it at the same moment and said nothing, because nothing he could say would be better than the silence of that moment. Joe had written to Austin Female College on Nora's behalf, sending the evidence ledger not as proof of trauma, but as proof of a mind. The letter of response arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to Miss Nora Barrett. See Mr. Caleb Holt, Redstone Ranch. Caleb brought it in and set it on the table in front of her without comment. Nora picked it up. Read the address. Set it down. Picked it up. Set it down. Got up and did the dishes for 20 minutes. Came back. Picked it up. She opened it. Read it twice. Put it in her apron pocket. 3 days later, she found Caleb in the barn and stood in the doorway until he looked up from the harness he was mending. If I went, she started. When you go, he said. Not looking up when, she tried the word. When I go. Sam and Pearl will be here. We'll be fine. We'll write you letters and expect letters back. I've been taking care of them since I know. He looked up now. Nora, you took care of them by running, by collecting evidence, by standing in that courtroom and saying what needed saying. That was what taking care of them looked like then. What it looks like now is different. You going to school, learning the law the right way, coming back with the tools to protect people like them that's still taking care of them. It's just a bigger version of the same thing. She was quiet for a while. What if I don't come back the same? You won't, he said. That's the point of going. The appleseed Pearl had planted in a clay pot on the kitchen windowsill in the first week had produced, after 40 days, a single pale green shoot, no bigger than her little finger. She found it on a Thursday morning before anyone else was up. She stood looking at it for a long time without calling anyone. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor, cross-legged, and just looked at it. When Tomas came in and found her there, he sat down next to her. I told you, Pearl said. You did. Everyone thought it was taking too long. I didn't. You're the only one. He looked at the small green shoot. Some things build the part you can't see before they show you any of it. The roots come before the stem. Nobody cheers for roots. But take the roots away, and there's no stem. Pearl, that's what happened to us. How do you mean? We were growing the part you couldn't see. Now you can. Tomas was quiet for a moment. Pearl Barrett, he said finally, you are going to give me something to think about for the rest of the month. Probably longer, Pearl said. Without pride, just accuracy. A letter came from Galveston County Jail addressed to Nora, Sam and Pearl Barrett, care of Caleb Holt. Caleb set it on the table. Nora held it for 2 days before she brought it downstairs and asked Caleb to read it to her. She wanted to hear it in someone else's voice first. Cutter's letter was short, not an apology asking for anything back, just a statement. I was not the man your mother thought she was marrying. I don't know exactly when I stopped being him. That's not your problem to work out. What happened in that house was mine to cause and mine to answer for. Not yours, not any piece of it. I wanted you to know that I know that. I don't expect anything from you. I just needed to say it. Caleb folded it. What do you want to do with it? Do I have to decide now? No. Do I have to forgive him? No, he said it clearly without softening it. Forgiveness is yours to give when and if and how you want to. For your own reasons, on your own time. Nobody gets to require it of you. If you forgive him someday, that'll be something you chose. If you don't, that'll be something you chose. Either way, it belongs to you. Nora put the letter in the back of the ledger, in the blank pages at the end. 2 weeks later, a second envelope arrived. Same Galveston postmark, but different handwriting. Careful, deliberate, the way someone writes when they've practiced the letters before committing them to the page. The name on the back flap was C. Barrett Clara, their mother. Caleb set it on the table in front of Nora without a word. She looked at the handwriting. At the return address, a boarding house on a street he didn't recognize. She picked it up. She didn't open it. She carried it upstairs and put it on the windowsill of her room, the window that faced east toward the ridge in the morning light. It was still there, unopened, when the chapter ended. It was supposed to be, because some things belong to the person holding them, on their own terms, in their own time. This one belonged to Nora, and Nora would open it when she was ready, or she wouldn't, and both of those were complete sentences. That evening, Lena stopped by with federal corroborating documents linking Doyle to activity in 2 additional states. She stayed for supper. She helped with the dishes, at the door, putting on her coat. Final hearing is Thursday. She didn't move toward her horse. Kalina, I've been stopping by here twice a week for 2 months. I noticed. I'm not going to pretend that's entirely about the case. I didn't think it was. A beat. All right then. Almost a smile. Thursday. She rode. He watched the road after she was gone. Then he closed the door. And from the top of the stairs came Pearl's voice, aiming carefully at Casual. She's coming back after Thursday, too. Right. Go to sleep. Pearl, that's not a no. Go to sleep. Pearl found the chute on Thursday morning. She had been checking the pot every day since October, without telling anyone, with the patience of someone who has decided to trust a process that isn't showing her anything yet. The chute was there, green and pale, and no bigger than her little finger. She stood looking at it for a long time. Then she went to the bottom of the stairs. She waited. His feet hit the floor. A minute later, he appeared at the top of the stairs. Hair loose, still half asleep. She pointed at the pot. He came down, looked at the chute. Looked at her, he signed. She shook her head. No, I told you they went and got Nora. Nora came down, looked at the chute. Signed back, I know. Then they knocked on Caleb's door. He opened it already dressed. He'd been up since 5. He looked at the pot. Looked at the 3 of them. Looked back at the pot. Took its time, he said. Good things do, Pearl said. And went to get her coat. Judge Dunmore read the guardian order in 12 minutes. Caleb Holt was granted permanent guardianship of Nora, Samuel, and Pearl Barrett, subject to review in 18 months. With the review expected to be a formality, the room was full again. Nobody was surprised by the outcome. But there was something different about hearing it said aloud, in a judge's voice, in a room where it would be recorded and kept. Knowing a thing and having a thing put into the record were not the same. After Dunmore read the order, she set the paper down and looked at the 3 children. The court doesn't require anything further from you today. But if any of you have something you'd like to say for the record, you're welcome to it. Nora shook her head. She'd said what she had to say. It was enough. Pearl shrugged, indicating she was fine. Sam stood up. The room went quiet in the particular way it goes quiet when something unexpected is about to happen. Not tense, just attentive. Like the room itself was paying attention. He stood with his hand barely moving against his leg. The rhythm Joe had taught him. He looked at Judge Dunmore, who looked back at him without rushing, without prompting, without filling the silence with anything at all. He spoke. 4 words, slowly, carefully, without stuttering once. We want to stay. The room held that silence for a moment, not from discomfort, from the particular stillness that follows something with real weight. Then Pearl said, from her seat, yeah, what he said, and the room laughed. The good kind, the kind that isn't at anyone. Dunmore's expression shifted by about 2 degrees, which was a lot for her. She nodded. So noted, she banged the gavel. Outside the courthouse, the October sun was hard and clean. Caleb walked out with Sam on one side and Pearl, who had claimed his left hand sometime in the past 3 weeks, and showed no signs of releasing it on the other. Nora walked beside him, not holding his hand because that wasn't who Nora was, but close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his arm. Is it real? Pearl, yes. We don't have to go anywhere else. No, we just get to stay. You just get to stay. She processed this for approximately 4 seconds. Okay, I need more seeds for spring. Can we stop at the mercantile? We can stop at the mercantile. And can Tomas come? He knows which seeds. I'll ask him. And can Lena come? She said it in the exact same tone as the question about Tomas. Pearl, she knows about plants, she told me, on Caleb's other side. Sam covered his mouth with his free hand. His shoulders shook. After the mercantile. After Tomas had chosen the spring seeds, and Pearl had paid with careful attention to the arithmetic. Caleb took them to the barn. He'd been working on the loft since September. Early mornings, before anyone else was up, without telling them. He led them up the ladder. The loft was clean. The broken harnesses and rusted crates were gone. The floor was swept. A south-facing window had been cut and glazed, letting in the afternoon light at a low winter angle. A small iron stove stood ready in the corner. A pine bookshelf built by hand stood against the east wall with 3 books on it. A Bible, a history of the United States that Joe had left, a thin volume of Emily Dickinson that Pruitt had sent over with a note that said she understood more about human nature than most people with medical degrees. Below the loft, a long swing hung from the central beam, a drawing board on an easel, chalk and charcoal in a tin can beside it. A small low desk with a row of wood-carving tools lined up neat and strung across the ceiling of the loft, from beam to beam in a long, warm line. 12 lanterns lit. Pearl counted them. 12, Caleb confirmed. Why 12? He thought about how to answer. Seemed like the right number. She looked at him with the expression she used when she suspected she wasn't getting the whole story, but was willing to accept the partial version for now. Okay, she said, and walked to the easel. Sam went to the desk. He picked up the smallest carving knife, held it, testing the weight. He looked at Caleb. Caleb nodded. Sam set it back down gently, in exactly the spot it had been. Nora climbed the loft ladder. She walked to the far corner where Caleb had preserved a section of the original floorboard, the old timber sanded smooth and fitted flush with the new floor, but kept. She'd asked him to keep it, weeks ago. And he hadn't made her explain why. She crouched down and put her hand flat on the wood. This is where I was, she said. That first night, I know. I wanted to stay here. I left it. She kept her hand on the wood for a moment. Then she stood and looked at him. Thank you for not making it nice. Thank you for leaving it exactly as it was. It's yours, he said. You decide what you do with it. She looked at the old floorboard one more time. I want to remember that the night I was most afraid in my whole life was also the night I got found. Evening came down slowly over Redstone Ranch. The children were asleep. The kitchen was quiet. Caleb sat at the table with coffee going cold in his hands. The door opened. Lena came in from the porch, where she'd been standing, looking at the ridge. She sat across from him. They were quiet in the way 2 people can be quiet when they've been learning the shape of each other's silences. What happens next, she said. Not about the case. I don't entirely know, he said. Nora leaves for school in the fall. Pearl has spring seeds. Sam has a new friend at the schoolhouse who's learning to sign. And us, he looked at her. At the table, back at her. I've been alone a long time. So have I. I'm not very easy. Neither am I. She met his eyes. Caleb, I've been riding out here twice a week for 2 months. Some of that was the case. Most of it wasn't. I know. I'm not asking for more than what's real. I'm asking if there's something real. He looked at his hands, at the scar running across the left one, at the table where he'd been setting 4 bowls every morning for weeks now, without thinking about it, at the woman who had shown up at his door with fever medicine before she knew him and had not stopped showing up since. There's something real, he said. She nodded, settled back in her chair. Good. That's enough for tonight. Is it? It is. We've both waited long enough to know that rushing the thing you actually want is a good way to break it. They sat with their coffee while the wind moved through the mesquite along the creek. The ridge was dark against the stars. Inside, 12 lanterns burned in the loft. Much later, after Lena had ridden home and the house was fully still, Caleb went to the porch. He stood in the cold with his hands in his pockets and looked up at the sky. The West Texas sky on a clear November night opens up wider than any other sky in any other place he'd ever been. No ceiling to it, just stars all the way to the ground. He thought about Maggie. For 11 years, he had thought about her with the quality of absence, the shape of what was missing. Tonight, it was different. Tonight, he thought about her the way you think about a gift, something given that can't be returned and isn't supposed to be. He thought, 11 years ago, a river took you from me. And because of that, I became the man who sat down on a barn floor instead of staying standing. And because of that, 3 children who needed someone to sit down are sleeping in this house tonight. He didn't say she'd planned it. He didn't say it was fair. He just thought, I'm grateful for who you made me. I'll spend whatever time I have left being worth it. He went inside. And for the first time in a very long time, the house didn't feel quiet the way empty feels quiet. It felt quiet the way full is quiet, when everything that belongs somewhere is there, settled for the night, breathing easy in the dark. In the kitchen, on the windowsill facing east, an apple shoot no bigger than a little finger turn, slowly and without hurry, toward the morning, when the dust finally settles on a story like this. What remains is never the gunfight, never the courtroom, and never even the names of the men who thought they controlled the outcome. What remains is something quieter, something far more difficult to forget. This was never just a story about Hector Doyle, or Wade Cutter, or the systems that allowed children to be treated like property long after the law said otherwise. It was never just about papers, statutes, or arrests. Those were only the visible edges of something much deeper. At its heart, this was a story about what happens when truth refuses to stay silent. Not the loud kind of truth. Not the kind that wins arguments in a room full of strangers, but the quiet truth that lives in a 14-year-old girl who learns to write down every detail because she understands, instinctively, that memory is the first form of justice. The kind of truth that lives in a boy who does not speak in words, but who still understands exactly when to move, when to watch, and when to protect the people beside him. And the kind of truth that lives in a 5-year-old child who can look at a broken situation and still see something worth believing in. In the West, we like to believe survival is about strength, about who stands taller, who speaks louder, who refuses to back down. But the truth this story leaves behind is different. Survival, real survival, is often about something far less dramatic. It is about being seen correctly for the first time after a lifetime of being misunderstood. It is about a doctor who asks permission before he touches a wound, because he understands that respect can begin where control once lived. It is about a sheriff who chooses to listen before acting, even when the easier path would be to follow procedure and walk away. And it is about a man like Caleb Holt, who never tries to become a hero, but instead does something far more consistent and far more rare. He stays. He stays when it would be easier to send someone else. He stays when silence would protect his peace. He stays when the cost of involvement becomes heavier than the comfort of distance. And in that decision, something begins to change. Because one of the hardest truths in life is this: you cannot fix what you are not willing to stand near. The story of Nora, Sam, and Pearl is not a story about being rescued. It is a story about being recognized, about the moment when a system that once ignored them is forced to record their names, their voices, their evidence, and their reality. And perhaps more importantly, it is about what happens after survival. Because survival alone is not the finish line. Survival is only the beginning of rebuilding a life that does not revolve around fear. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.